The subject of this discussion will be types of theology. The sources will be derived from a blog spot and also a discussion on interreligious theology and religious pluralism in general. Quote from the Gifford Lectures. On the subject of interreligious theology, which is another category or type of theology. Every theologian operates in combinations of these particular types or modes, with certain of them being primary and others secondary. There are categories and subcategories as well, such as eco-theology or feminist theology, etc. Furthermore, the various modes within which a certain theologian works can be ordered in particular ways, such that certain modes serve more or less as a basis for movement towards other modes. In other words, they intersect, depending on which particular subject you are studying, whether it be science, philosophy, or world religions. There is a lot of flexibility. The descriptions here refer to the modes that tend to mean, when adopted as the primary theological mode. And in this case, panentheism, with its variations in relation to interreligious theology, which is basically the summation of this channel. It's extremely interreligious, designed perhaps to encourage better interreligious understanding and interfaith dialogue, which is always good. So, one, we have biblical theology. This mode of theology is interested in unpacking the theological meaning of the biblical text. It can function at the level of canon, author, book, chapter, verse, phrase, or word. It can be pursued with varying degrees of attention to the history of the text, whether history of development or history of reception. And we have confessional theology. Confessional theology takes as its starting point the theological affirmations of a particular theological tradition, often identified in terms of denomination, sect. It seeks to develop the particular insights of that particular tradition and to provide a compelling expression of that tradition in light of the contemporary situation. Constructive theology, innovation, and idiosyncrasy are prized in constructive theology, where the goal is to take the theological tradition, broadly or narrowly conceived, in heretofore undeveloped or underdeveloped directions. It is often individualistic and academic in orientation. Contextual theologies. Contextual theology takes the contemporary situation with utmost seriousness and looks for ways to address that situation. Liberation and feminist theologies are fine examples of contextual theologies, so those are subcategories. But postmodern theologians and American evangelical theology would fall broadly within this designation as well, although the latter perhaps not in terms of intent. Indeed, all theology ought to be contextual to some degree. Dogmatic theology. First, in a Barthian-style dogmatic theology, is concerned with doing theology in service of the church institution. In this sense, is similar to confessional theology, which is related to a version of scientific theology. Pursued in a Roman Catholic style dogmatic theology is similar to normative theology. One's understanding of dogmatic theology relates to how one parses that relationship between dogma and dogmas, or doctrines. Ecumenical theology is similar to confessional theology, except that it works with a much more broadly defined tradition, namely Nicaea, Chaldean, and their derivative councils. It looks for paths toward unity, where the various sub-traditions need not give up their emphasis, even if they must learn to appreciate and incorporate the emphasis of other sub-traditions. Interreligious and interfaith theologies are types of ecumenical theology. Philosophical theology seeks to bring theology into conversation with philosophy. This can be done in two ways. First, it can be done by bringing the tools of philosophical analysis, as well as philosophical modes of thought, philosophical topics, metaphysics, etc., to bear critically upon theology. Second, it can be done by bringing theology to bear constructively upon philosophical analysis, philosophical theories, and modes of thought. Symbiotic panentheism and panentheism's variations would definitely fall into this category. Natural theology attempts to establish knowledge of God without appeal to specifically Christian revelation. Many Christians therefore reject natural theology in all of its subcategories to a degree, because they see it as a rejection of the Christian revelation, which is not necessarily the case. It traditionally depends heavily on certain forms of metaphysics, cosmology, and ethical theory. So a Bible-only believing Christian may or may not reject natural theologies, which also includes the concept of spiritual or cosmic evolution theories. We have normative theology undertaken from a or by a certified authority within a particular ecclesial polity. Normative theology is pursued whenever theological statements are made by which a particular ecclesial identity is constituted or delimited. Nicaea and Chaldean councils are examples of such statements, such as the Nicene Creed, for example, as is the Augsburg Confession It is operative for Roman Catholics wherever the Pope speaks, ex cathedra. Next we have scientific theology. How one conceives of scientific theology depends on how one understands science. For instance, Charles Hodge, working with more or less Baconian understanding of science, described theology as the collection and ordering of facts found within the biblical text. Another example is Torrance, or T.F. Torrance, who, working with a more or less Einstein conception of science, describes theology in terms of being confronted by and in turn expressing in a limited way the reality of God. Next we have systematic theology. There are different ways for theology to be pursued in systematic modes. It can be understood in terms of a logically deductive system where a single first principle or a collection of such principles are analyzed and synthesized in the production of a system. It can also be understood in the locale communes way, where various theological topics are ordered and discussed, usually in a creedal sequence. In either case, and most basically, systematic theology is concerned with penetrating to and explicating the relations inherent between the various locales of Christian doctrine. Next is historical theology, a mode of theological engagement that focuses on theological texts, thinkers, and schools from the past. In keeping with the dictum that those who do not know the past are bound to repeat it, all modes of theological inquiry should have their historical elements in this way. Historical theology, like biblical theology, provides vital raw materials for further theological development and growth, as well as helps to elucidate the context within the theological inquiry is pursued in the present. Pastoral theology is next. While theology is inherently practical, it is possible to do theology with greater or lesser attention to particular pastoral situations, and the way in which theology claims are made concrete in individual and community life. This is the task of the pastoral theology. Practitioners in this discipline often use tools and approaches from the social sciences. A subcategory is political theology. Here we have a theological mode that brings together many of the others. For political theology, done right, must be biblical, is necessary confessional, is always constructive if it is to address the people and problems of its own time and place, which also makes it contextual, normative, systematic, historical, and what could be more pastoral, etc. Jesus gave his followers 2 great commandments, and in the sphere of political theology, one deals with the intersection of the love of God and the love of neighbor. There are perhaps more subcategories within theological schools of thought, but this is the basic framework of theological thought, and it pretty well covers pretty much everything. So with the title of this channel being Comparative Theological Science, we can get into the comparative theology as well as interfaith and interreligious theology, which is another category which intersects with what was just listed in many aspects. They intersect with one another. They interlap. So a quote from the book Religious Pluralism and Interreligious Theology, from a brief section of the Gifford Lectures from Perry Schmidt Luckel. Originally from the 2015 Gifford Lectures on religious pluralism and interreligious theology, which is relatively a new category, and how this in effect relates to process and panentheism, and how panentheism synthesizes religions across the board. So the quote here is from page 143. It's called Seeking Reciprocal Illumination on Comparative Theology. Quote, more than once, Wilfred Cantwell Smith expressed the imaginative aspect of interreligious theology by stating that in order, and using Buddhism as an example, in order, quote, to understand Buddhists, we must not look at something called Buddhism, but at the world as a whole, so far as possible through Buddhist eyes. And you can replace this with Hinduism or Judaism, depending on which tradition you're studying. Continuing, it will take long and sustained studies before one might become able to look at the world through the eyes of one's religious neighbor, but once one begins doing so, one of the things one is likely to see will be one's own religious tradition, perhaps in a different light. This may be a painful but at the same time wholesome experience. I think that after World War II, Christian theology has benefited tremendously from looking at Christianity through Jewish eyes. To what extent has Christian theology started to look at Christianity through Muslim eyes, Hindu eyes, or Buddhist eyes, for example? Analogously, this also applies to the self-perception and partner perception of all other religions. Positive interfaith dialogue. Have Buddhists begun to look at Buddhism through Hindu eyes, or vice versa? The effort of assuming reciprocal perspectives characterizes the comparative theological work as it needs to be done in interreligious theology. Interreligious theology is not undertaking the purportedly neutral and distance comparison attempt by the phenomenological schools. It is rather a way of looking at one's own tradition through the eyes of another tradition, and of helping others in their attempts to look at their tradition through our own eyes. In his classic, The Way of All the Earth, John Donne aptly described this shift in perspectives as the process of passing over and coming back. If in the context of a global multi-religious colloquium, this shift of perspectives is carried out by all participants and with mutual assistance, interreligious comparison or comparative theology carries the promise of what Arvind Sharma recently called reciprocal illumination. Our self-understanding and the understanding of our own religious tradition may change if it is seen in the light of the other or religious other. Unfortunately, the major traditions have adopted perhaps historically negative views of the religious other, and interreligious theology and interfaith ministry is there but to help with dialogue, perhaps to cultivate a positive view of the religious other. At least that is the hope. And within the context of panentheism as a basic framework, this is indeed possible. Cooperation rather than religious competition is the motive. This is what interreligious theology is hoping for. This is the expectation that governs and guides its comparative investigations, but it is reciprocal, not one-sided illumination. Inasmuch as reciprocal illumination brings about changes in religious understanding, religion itself, the religions themselves, are transformed. A change or a reform in self-understanding is at the same time a transformation of the self. Changes in the understanding of our religious traditions to move perhaps from exclusivism to inclusivism, and perhaps even a broader perspective of religious pluralism, or the many in the one and the one in the many. Changes in religious traditions and understanding them may contribute to a historical process in which these traditions themselves will change. Change can be good. This is why interreligious theology is also creative, constructive, or transformative. End quote. So in doing theology as a whole, there are quite a substantial amount of categories and subcategories you can focus on. In this particular page, it's comparative. Not promoting one over and above the other, but rather laying it all out so that it can be perhaps investigated on a deeper level. Many are unaware of these categories and subcategories within theology. And I've brought this information together in this discussion because it perhaps will encourage others to see things through the eyes of the religious other in perhaps a more positive and constructive manner. At least that is the hope.